Hello everyone. So in this section of course, we will be discussing about JUnit 5 dynamic test. So we will be focusing on what is a dynamic test and we'll see the demonstration of dynamic test in our upcoming lectures. So here what is a dynamic test? So here you can see as the name suggests dynamic, a dynamic test is a test generated during runtime. So if you see the normal tests which we annotated with @test are basically static tests which are specified at the compile time. So by using dynamic test, we can generate a test during runtime. So the method which generates this dynamic test is called as factory method, and this method is basically annotated with @test factory to let JUnit 5 know that this method will produce the dynamic test. And when we write this factory method, these methods cannot be marked as private or static. So as this factory method cannot be marked as private or static, this factory method must return a single dynamic node. So we'll discuss about dynamic node in a bit, or a stream, collection, iterator, iterable, or array of dynamic node instances. So friends, the return type of @test factory method should be either dynamic node or a stream, collection, iterator, iterable, or array of dynamic node instances. And in case anything else is written, the JUnit exception is thrown. So here when JUnit 5 sees @test factory method, it knows the return type will be of type dynamic node or simply multiple dynamic node returned via stream, collection, iterator, iterable, or array. So your dynamic node is an abstract class which is parent to dynamic test, and usually in test factory we create the instance of dynamic test, and as it is a child to dynamic node, we simply return dynamic test from the test factory method. So the way we write dynamic test is that it consists of two parts. One is the display name and other is the executable. So the display name is nothing but the name of our test, and executable, which we already discussed in our previous lecture, that it's a functional interface which basically executes a piece of code and may throw a throwable. So friends, whenever you write dynamic test using @test factory annotation, the disadvantage with the dynamic test is they do not support the lifecycle methods such as @before each, @after each, and many other lifecycle methods. So friends, here you can see the dynamic node class hierarchy. So dynamic node is an abstract class, and usually the dynamic tests are written, which basically returns a dynamic test instance or a collection of dynamic test instance. There is one more class which is known as dynamic container. So as the name suggests, container. So what it does is when we create a dynamic container, this dynamic container can have multiple dynamic tests, and also it can consist of other dynamic containers. So basically you can think of dynamic container as a group of dynamic tests along with dynamic container. So we can think of dynamic container is basically a composition of dynamic test and dynamic container. So for example, when we write our dynamic test, we can create a dynamic container. So this dynamic container can internally have the dynamic test and can have other dynamic container which internally has multiple dynamic tests and can be composed of dynamic container. So this chain can go to any length because dynamic container can contain another dynamic container, and this forms a chain. So friends, let's go to Eclipse and see the demonstration of how we can create a dynamic test and how we can use dynamic container to create the dynamic test.